Thank you, Nick. What I'll start with now is firstly by thanking Tim Flannery especially for asking me to be involved today and all the organisers. I won't be using any PowerPoints because I had the advantage of a live model outside, so I'll just give you a bit more information about me, my family, what we do. I'm a third generation family farmer from Bathurst in New South Wales. We're superfine wool growers. That's really what we do. We try to specialise in, although we've diversified a little bit recently with first cross lambs and I guess opportunity cropping. So cropping's always a part of what we do. It's probably important for me to say, as a lead up, why I'm here, how this happened, why we did that outside, why we've changed the focus in the way that we operate, and that I guess really I'm an average wool grower, but with an open mind, and I was placed in a position where I could receive a lot of further information and training, and part of this was involved there being a carrot at the end of it, or an incentive to try to do these things. They were things that you could dream about doing and everyone might potentially like to do, but not seriously contemplate that you could ever pull it off. I think it's really important when we talk about the debate, particularly the climate change debate, carbon, that industry is not very backward in coming forward and talking about the incentives and what they need to do it. I think when we're trying to talk about solutions and having improving things, that we need to think about what motivates people and what's going to get action on the ground. And I know for my part, definitely being supported and encouraged is one thing, but if you can't pay for it, you can't do it. So as a very brief summary of what we're doing on our property, we decided to look at everything on farm in how we operated and perhaps try to see how much we could let nature solve some of our problems. And that's a bit sort of, I guess we're leaning on some of the catchphrases or the Mother Earth statements, but it really is the basis of what we decided to do. So whether that was erosion control, weed control, even to that extent, and reduction in chemicals, if you step back, if you let the natural diversity in your pastures come forward, then weeds have basically become a non-issue on our farm. It wasn't all that long ago that we bought a bigger boom spray because I couldn't get around things quickly enough to control weeds, and that is not the case anymore. We just do not spray any pasture weeds at all because our pastures are healthy and robust and they look after it themselves. I think it's another important fact to say that agriculture or food and fibre production is an essential industry, and that in the debate with carbon, quite often we're quoted figures on our carbon footprint nationally or the amounts of carbon that perhaps are involved in agricultural production. We also feed a lot of other people in the world, so perhaps the priority needs to be placed in there somewhere on which carbon emissions are essential as opposed to the ones that are perhaps not quite as essential. I think agriculture and land management should, as Johannes mentioned too, should be at the centre of some of our discussions regarding climate change solutions. So it's rarely in the climate and carbon debate in an industry can you tick more boxes than you can with agriculture. And it was also mentioned earlier that the issue of additionality comes into it, and if people aren't certain what that means, is that under some of the systems, or I'm pretty sure the Kyoto Protocol mentioned something along those lines, that in carbon trading anyway, that if it was something you were going to do anyway, then you won't get credit for it. But when you look at the huge environmental advantages of attempting carbon farming, really that should be another reason that they desperately try to promote and make incentives available for that to happen. Simply because carbon can be sequestered in the soil and it can be managed and the environmental outcomes enhanced. And these include water management, soil management and increasing your biodiversity on farm. I've been very interested in the speakers that have been in Melbourne, and there have been some extremely knowledgeable people talking there. Some people from the energy sector, and everyone will have heard mention of carbon capture technology, so carbon capture and storage technology. That's what a farm is. I mean, our farm is one huge solar panel, and we use this is the grass. The grass is a solar powered organism. So the plants capture that energy. They sequester carbon. It's what you do as a farmer with that carbon that's important. And the management techniques that you use can directly affect the amounts of carbon that you might be able to sequester in your soil. So, you know, really at the basic level, farms and farmers and agriculture as an industry should be involved in this. Now, it's both above and below ground parts of the plant that are doing this. So the roots and the management of the leaves, when you graze, that means that the roots, when you graze a plant, the plant then prunes its roots back and leaves carbon in the soil. And the more you can do this with a healthy plant, the more carbon you're going to sequester. The length of the sequestration period is really the only potential variable. So whether or not you're going to put that carbon in the soil and have it stay, or whether it's going to be re-released into the atmosphere as CO2. So biochar is an extremely long-term storage of carbon. Carbon sequestration in the soil through farmers' management is up to the management techniques that they use. It's still possible to build a pool of soil carbon that can be maintained, so that if you, even though there are inputs going in and out of that system, that you can maintain a certain level at all times. And it's also been argued, you know, it's too hard to measure. If you can't measure it, you can't pay for it. All those things are part of the challenge for, I guess, the scientific community to step up and to find methods to do it, because the potential for soil sequestration of carbon is so large, and if incentives are provided, the benefits for everyone, not just farmers. I mean, farmers will benefit and the community as well. So I think it's an extremely important area that should be talked about, rather than the traditional methods of carbon capture and storage and the huge amounts of money that are going to be put into coal carbon capture, CO2 carbon capture and storage, which is not proven, and no one knows exactly how that might all pan out. Look, I think one main point I want to say is that since the time that the project we started was conceived, the technology has come an extremely long way. The controller in that machine is twice as powerful as it was going to be. The battery pack is probably 60% greater storage than we were going to have. The solar array that we have to power it, the cost of the panels came down so that we put a system in that was 25% greater. This is all in 18 months to 2 years. I think that most of the great breakthroughs and the real innovations that are going to solve a lot of problems on farm regarding climate change, emissions, everything else, and in the broader community, most of those solutions probably haven't been invented yet, just gauged by the progress that we've had in some of this technology. So I think there's a huge reason to be very optimistic about what might come. And whilst the technology and I guess not making those emissions is very important, the actual carbon that we don't emit from using a technique like a solar-powered seed drill, that carbon saving fades into insignificance compared to even small gains in soil carbon on farm. So we talk multiple levels of carbon that can be saved on farm through good management techniques. I'd just probably say that I'm very happy to be a wool grower, because I think wool is probably quite obviously the world's most environmentally friendly fibre. I'm wearing a Bendigo Mills woolen jumper, which has kept me beautifully warm out there despite how cold it was. And I'd just close by saying I really think it's very important that the carrot is a much better incentive than the stick in trying to get things to happen. So particularly regards to agriculture and carbon emissions, that might be something that is at the front of what people think.
Thank you very much, Michael. With no further ado, I think we can go straight to Alan, if you can come up. And Alan's got two handouts just over there which people can pick up as they leave.
Thank you, Nick. And I'd also like to thank Tim Flannery for inviting me today. It's a credit to you and Nick, Tim. The whole Deakin Lecture series is about solutions, and so it's really a positive forum, not a talk fest. I spent most of my life outside Cunnamulla. I was actually north of Burke, not back of Burke for what it was worth, and we were the ones that actually invented climate change and global warming, and now the whole rest of the world seems to be catching on. During my 30 years of running a grazing property, prior to leaving in 2000, nobody ever told me that I was managing carbon. That's what my day job was. The communication process saw the carbon cycle as just another cycle, along with the nutrient cycle and the water cycle. This is why I came up with the term carbon grazing in 2001 and why I wrote the book. If the carbon cycle fails, then the other cycles fail. That's why it's so important. Why is carbon so important? Because energy, nutrients and water all follow carbon. They're your factors of production. Now, going back to the basics, the only way that carbon can move from the atmosphere to your paddock is via photosynthesis. Think of plants as the entry point of carbon. Given that it is moisture that promotes photosynthesis, then it is moisture that promotes the introduction of carbon. Nature has designed the system so that water activates the storage of carbon in the landscape. If you think about it logically, the bulk of the carbon enters the landscape in the short period following rain. This highlights the need to focus management around this point in time. Letting animals eat plants when they are trying to grow after rain reduces photosynthesis and in some cases completely shuts it down. Now I'm going to lead into the carbon grazing principle. Remember, it is a principle and not a new land management system. It applies to all successful land management. Because there is no pattern to when rain arrives, in other words, when carbon arrives, the message is that pasture rest is timing and not time. Basing resting decisions on a certain period of time is no guarantee that carbon is going to arrive. This is not an attack on cell grazing. I just don't have time to go any further on that point of explaining why cell grazers actually achieve what they do achieve. It was scientists I met in South Africa who started me thinking, how long do pastures need to be rested for to keep paddocks resilient? They suggested that with average pastures, removing animals for 3 to 8 weeks after rain increases pasture production by 50 to 80%. When people say they can't afford to rest pastures, it begs the question, can you afford not to? Carbon grazing is 4 to 6 weeks rest after rain. The period does not commence until the plants actually start growing. Also, it is important to not get caught up on the exact time, as temperature will influence the necessary time. Carbon grazing is about maximising carbon flows. It's the window of opportunity too many people miss. The practical aspect of seeing pasture rest as timing instead of time is that you only need to find a home for the animals for a short period of time. And my book that's actually there at the moment discusses where the animals can be put, because at the end of the day we've all got a bank manager and you just can't go selling animals for the purpose of resting pastures. In the mid-1990s, I was approached to conduct a $272,000 drought regional initiative project. This project was about achieving animal performance while on old man saltbush plantations. Then, saltbush could be used as somewhere to put the animals when it rained at the end of dry spells. The drought resistance of saltbush was now being utilised at the end of dry spells instead of during them. CSIRO saw this as a paradigm shift, using saltbush in the mud and not the dust. Next slide, please. This slide highlights what can happen when animals are allowed to eat grass every time it tries to grow after rain. The sick plant on the left has depleted energy reserves, so is struggling to come out of dormancy after what was actually handy rain. A bit of resting after rain to let energy in is like keeping some charge in the battery. To understand the failure on the right-hand side of the fence, think of the soil as a construction site. What lives in the soil keeps it well structured and fertile. If plants are not allowed to grow and feed carbon compounds to all the workers, then they die. Present carbon flows rely on past carbon flows. Just as money makes money, so carbon makes carbon. These images highlight that resilience relies on carbon flows. Think of resilience as having two components, plant resilience and soil resilience. The best way to cope with climate change is increasing the resilience of your paddocks. Resilient paddocks are capable of absorbing changing circumstances, while fragile ones just collapse, even with small changes. Think about who goes into drought first. You all know bare paddocks are always hotter. This slide highlights that removing carbon from the atmosphere and making money is the same thing. And that's one of my real themes today. It's making money and getting good carbon outcomes is exactly the same thing. Both rely on increasing water use efficiency. Taking water use efficiency further, perennials bring down more carbon than annuals over time. Next slide, thanks. This slide is about restarting carbon flows. This is a long-term clay pan where the soil component of resilience had failed years ago. This is planting the carbon cycle where it can't establish naturally from seed. The left-hand image is old man saltbush 12 months after it was planted. The second image is another year later. Sheep are responsible for the lack of leaves. They are after some protein to reduce methane emissions per kg of production. Another linkage between profit and environmental, I should say, carbon outcomes. In this slide, you can see the carbon cycle is expanding away from the shrubs. In other words, the landscape is becoming more resilient. It is the carbon flows introduced by the planted saltbush which has improved the soil. As the soil improved, grass was able to germinate and further promote the carbon cycle. All this happened over a 2-year period at Jalaban, which is just over the Queensland border. It's not far from Gundawindi. This happened when rainfall was below average. This outcome highlights that climate change does not have to destroy your business and it does not have to destroy your landscape. This image reinforces something that really needs to be promoted, and that is the greenhouse outcomes of the grazing industry are a reflection of economic efficiency. If you are responsible for higher greenhouse gases per kg of production than your neighbour, then your neighbour is making more money than you are. It's that simple. If there are any policy people here today, the most cost-effective method of reducing greenhouse gases is explaining to rural producers how to make more money. Making money has more appeal than saving the planet. Summing up, with carbon, once you understand the flows, you see the dynamics of the whole landscape and how it functions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. That was fantastic. Thank you for being so precise, both in terms of time and communication. That was really great. Now we have Stephen Joseph, who's very sensibly dressed, may I say.
I'd like to take my hat off both to Tim and to Johannes and put it back on again because I don't like the cold. I want to thank Tim for inviting me to these lectures. And I'd like to say that both Tim and Johannes have been inspirations to me. I ran a renewable energy business for 23 years and got very disheartened. And I met Tim 3 years ago, and Johannes a bit more than 3 years ago, and I've actually, I think, got faith again, having lost faith with trying to actually get renewable energy up and running. I want to talk a little bit about a journey that I've been on, and I want to talk about trying to get a biomass industry, a biochar industry going in Australia. I've had quite a lot of experience in Victoria with a number of different groups trying to get a biochar industry or biochar ventures going, all of which have not taken off. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why they haven't taken off and maybe how we can get ventures that are profitable and help our farming systems. As Tim mentioned, I started off learning about biochar from Aborigines, and I'd like to pay my respect to the local Aborigines here. I started off working, in fact, in Bourke in northern New South Wales, and then ended up having 3 years in Arnhem Land. And one of the things that I learnt working with Aborigines was one, a respect for the land, and two, a respect for fire. Fire's been a really important part of the changes within the ecological system of Australia. Tim's written quite extensively about this. One of the first things I learned is that Aborigines understood when to light fires and where to light fires to actually benefit the environment. And I could talk for a long period of time about this, but just to say that they taught me about the benefits of very cool fires and mosaics of fires. So you never light a big fire, you light little fires all around the place. And the reason they do that is, one, to encourage biodiversity, and two, to make sure that you're renewing the land on a continual cycle. The second thing I'd like to say is that influenced the way I looked at biochar and not only the science of biochar, but how you applied biochar. So we don't see biochar as the be-all and end-all of capturing carbon in soils. We see it as part of the solution, and it needs to be adapted to different farming systems. And I'd also like to take my hat off to the gentleman on the stage, because Australia has the most amazing group of farmers who are incredibly innovative. You know, we underestimate the innovation potential of our farmers, and given the fact that they have very little support, they do some incredible things. So having said that, let me draw your attention to a diagram that Johannes and I put together for one of the chapters of the book, which sort of illustrates why it's very difficult to get biochar ventures up and running. We heard yesterday all of the difficulties involved around getting a carbon trading system up and running. Biochar exists within this economic, environmental, social and cultural framework. And unfortunately, within Australia, we have a framework that is not very favourable for getting biochar industries up and running. And I could talk for a long time, but I'd like to leave the negative aspects of what's going on and look at the very positive aspects of how I think we can get an industry up and running. And I want to focus on Victoria, since I've spent probably the last 10 years trying to get projects up and running here. Victoria actually has some wonderful resources. The first resource that I was involved in was at Maryvale Pulp and Paper Mill. And at the moment, the mill produces about 100,000 tonnes of waste, which they landfill. And we did some work where we took that waste and we formed biochar. And one of my colleagues in the Department of Primary Industries in New South Wales did some field trials. And lo and behold, putting 10 tonnes a hectare of biochar increased yields of maize by about 30 or 40%. But not only did they increase the yields of the maize, they started dealing with the acid sulphate soils problems up in northern New South Wales. And I thought, great, you know, here is an amazing resource that's been put in a hole and not used. So here's an industry. So we had this great big effort. We did endless studies, we built a plant, we did trials, we talked with the paper mill, we thought we had investment capital. And the company that was going to fund it was Babcock & Brown. Now, I think you all know the story of Babcock & Brown. Not only did we have Babcock & Brown going down the gurgler, we also had the problem that the Maryvale paper and pulp mill changed hands. That went from, I think it's now in Japanese hands. So we must have spent 5 years, and we spent $2 or $3 million. We did incredible design work, really great experimental work on agronomic trials. End of the story. So you can imagine that was one of my disappointments in the early 2000s. We also started working with the poultry cluster in Loddon. Now, it is a huge concentration of poultry manure in that area. Everybody was really enthusiastic. They were going to put a centre together. They were going to bring the manure to the centre. We were going to create renewable electricity. We were going to make poultry litter biochar, and that was going to displace a large amount of the chemical fertilisers that were being used. Again, lots of trials. We did agronomic trials. We found that poultry litter biochar is really plant effective within that sort of soil system in, around Loddon. And nothing happened. And there's a whole range of reasons why nothing happened. We couldn't get finance. There were issues, governance issues about all of the growers getting together. There was issues about support from the state government. They couldn't get decent electricity prices, so we couldn't get the project to become viable. You know, and here is an area that has 100, 200, maybe even 200,000 tonnes of waste that at the moment is really not being used very effectively. So if we look at this diagram, we have a rural area that has a resource, that has people that want to use the resource effectively, that are importing large amounts of chemical fertilisers, but we don't have the support at the financial, the investment and the government level to actually get a project like that off the ground. It was interesting. I was asked to talk to a delegation of people from the Victorian Parliament about this, and the local member was there. And I explained to her, I said, you have this amazing resource. You have a new industry. Why can't we get support? And she didn't have an answer. I still haven't lost heart. Again, a very interesting situation where there was a person that was involved in waste management, and he teamed up with a person that had a sawmill. Victoria has a great, still has a very vibrant forestry industry. Lots of waste, wasn't being used very effectively. So we did some work with them, turning into biochar and looking at it generating electricity. And we tried to do a project, and we were stumped by the Department of Agriculture. They weren't interested. They wouldn't, we even offered to give them some money to do some trials, and they weren't interested in doing the trials. So the people who actually wanted to get the industry going were disheartened. Project finished. Even worse was we were asked to go down and look at Glenelg Hopkins, where there's a major problem with dairy waste. It's being put in holes. Every now and then when it floods, the dairy waste ends up in the waterways. In that area, they have a large amount of green waste, and we put together a proposal to do some work, which we did, and was very positive. The economics looked good. Everybody was really keen on it. We actually got some Commonwealth government money to go ahead to do the next phase of the feasibility study. And then all of a sudden I received a letter from the local people involved in the management of the project saying, sorry, the funding's been taken away. And it turned out the Department of Agriculture didn't want us to go ahead with the project. So here we are, we have knowledge, we have technology, we have people who are skilled and dedicated. How do we get a project off the ground? So I want to throw this out to farmers, because I think the projects have got to start on the farm. You know, I've tried working with the waste management people, I've tried working with big industry, but I think it's the farmers that are going to get this up and running. I have a bit of a sad tale. We thought we'd actually just got money to actually set up our own farm. where we were going to put a biochar farm on a plant, a plant on a farm. The farm we were going to buy was right next to a very large chicken poultry operation. And right opposite the road was a huge cut flower operation that was buying a large amount of fertilisers. Absolutely ideal. We actually employed someone from Melbourne, a chap called Darren Doherty, who's an expert in rainwater harvesting. And we were actually going to set it up as a permaculture system where we were going to put in our biochar plant. We were going to use the energy from the pyrolysis process to heat greenhouses and to get aquaculture going. So it was a totally integrated system. We'd done all the economics. We actually had support from the local council. And we had a number of people who were into sustainable agriculture. We're going to use yeoman's ploughs, which again is an Australian invention, which it seems to work extremely well. Unfortunately, our funders cut our funding, but we're not going to give up. And I think the story that I bring to you is there is so much know-how about how to do these projects. It is not an issue of technology, it's not an issue of science. It's really an issue of political will, of having the right policies in place and finding some farmers who really want to experiment. And I'd like to finish on that note.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's an ideal introduction to Andrew Broad, who's President of the Victorian Farmers Federation. Andrew, as someone who's been patiently listening, I wonder if you could address how one can make things that are interesting, important, relevant and potentially apply them at scale. Andrew Broad.
Very good. Well, can I firstly just thank you for taking the time to come here. I've got a friend of mine from Belfast and he can't wait for global warming. And I think in a cold environment, in a cold old hall, a bit of global warming wouldn't go astray this afternoon. But look, one of the challenges I think that we've always been involved in, and I farm just out the road at Bridgewater. We own about 3,000 acres, us and the bank. We're joint shareholders. And we share farm another 2,000 acres. And I've also been fortunate enough to look at agricultural policy and trade in 25 countries. And one of the challenges I always had and concerns I had with the proposed carbon pollution reduction scheme was it was very narrow in its focus. And in my role as President of the Victorian Farmers Federation, I met with Minister Wong and I said there are lots of things we can be doing to be global responsible citizens, things that farmers can be doing. And she said, no, this is the Kyoto construct. If it doesn't fit within the Kyoto construct, it's not a reduction. And so firstly, I want to commend Tim for having a forum such as this, because what we are doing is we are looking outside of the Kyoto construct. We are looking at new ideas. And the only way we are going to be global responsible citizens is if we have a broad charter and looking at ways to reduce our emissions. The challenge is really, if you think it through, it is a consumption problem. We have 6 billion people in the world and we are attempting to tax production. You cannot fix a consumption problem by taxing production. You have to look at how you can minimise your consumption. Now, you can minimise your consumption in two ways. One, you can eat less and you can get skinnier. Now, I think my wife would certainly prefer that I did that just to this point. Or you can use the best science we can to reduce our consumption. And that can be a whole myriad of things. That can be using renewable energies. That can be using biotechnology. It can be using no-till technology. The role of chemicals into our farming systems also plays a part in this. We have used chemicals, but we have reduced our fossil fuel burning in diesel. So it's not a hard and fast rule, it's a real mix. And if there's one thing I've learnt in farming in the Australian environment is if you find the right system, don't stick with it. That's true. No-till technology, a fantastic system. But if you use it to its fullest extent, you run into resistant weed problems. The danger of putting too high a focus on soil carbon is, in Australia, sometimes you do need to burn a stubble. And if you legislate that you get soil carbon credits and then you've got to go and pay out, you also have got to pay out to change your farming system. So there's a challenge. But I want to put it this way, in fact, this is what my focus is. I am a pragmatist. I am a farmer. What I am interested in is producing the most food out of the rainfall that I receive. So if I get a very, very wet year, I want to produce the most food I can. If I get a very, very dry year, I want to produce the most food I can. And whilst we've been having this climate change discussion politically around Australia over the last number of years, our federal and state governments has progressively been cutting back their funding for research and development. We are now 70% of the levels of what we were in 1970. And so we're having an analytical discussion. We're talking about the greatest moral challenge of our time whilst we're reducing our capacity to feed ourselves, and feed ourselves in the best environmentally friendly way. The beauty of Australian farmers, and I've got 10,000 members in the Victorian Farmers Federation, and they never agree with anyone. Farmers don't agree with anything. And I've got 10,000 of them, and I've got to get an agreed position. It's impossible, but that's their strength. We look over the fence and we see what this guy's doing and we say, that's interesting. I might adapt a little bit of this. And we look over a fence and we see what this guy's doing and we say, that's interesting. I might adapt a little bit. And I've learned stuff here today. You know, no kill. It's new, it's innovative, it's something different. I might try a bit of that. And that is the strength of Australian farmers. And I think that's what I guess I want to emphasise out of you. We should be proud of what we do here. If you go down to the Bendigo Livestock Exchange on a Monday morning, you will see some of the best prime lamb that you will see anywhere in Australia. In fact, Woolworths has their head buyer based here in Bendigo. And do you know that there are some countries in the world where Australian red meat is 98% of their total protein needs? So whilst we're having this discussion about a tax regime that might inhibit production here, that is an immoral discussion to be having. What we should be having a discussion on is how do we maximise the food production capacity of our soils in Australia in the best environmentally friendly fashion. And that is really where you're going to reduce emissions. And I'll explain it this way. If you go over to the Amazon and have a look over there, why is the Amazon getting carved up? It's demand for beef and soybean. It's demand for food. And a person is not going to starve at the expense of the environment. The issue of climate change, the issue of being a responsible global citizen, is about ensuring that we can produce the food in the most sustainable environmental fashion and not carve up our environment in the developing nations to do it. Australia exports 2/3 of what we produce, and we have an obligation to be pushing for research and development. We have an obligation to, as Australian citizens, as global citizens, to ensure that we can feed the world, that we can be responsible citizens, and we can advocate for that. And I just want to say thank you for coming along today. It has been a bit cold, sometimes a bit dry, but certainly being involved in the discussion about the broad charter of the different farming systems we can develop, the need for research and development, the interaction of science, producers, markets and exporters, and good trade policy is what's going to take us forward. It won't be a tax regime, it'll be a mix, and together, if we've got the sole focus, we will be responsible global citizens. Thanks.
We've got a microphone here and a microphone there. If people want to stand up, a question to the resource that we have on the stage. I see Ian Blair moving forward to ask the first question. Ian.
Ian Blair
sustainability consultant. It's a question for Johannes. Can you comment on the need for nitrogen, phosphorus and sulphur to sustain our biomass in the soils? Because that's the other side of biochar, to keep that living carbon in the soil. And that's got to be part of the equation. Can you comment on that, please?
That's an important consideration. I'm pleased that I can respond to that. Microbial life and carbon cycles is very important to soil health and plant health. The rhizosphere is full of microorganisms and they all need to feed off something, and that something is usually organic carbon. Biochar itself is largely recalcitrant carbon, will not be eaten by the microorganisms. So you always have to have some carbon cycling. It's not an either or. And nitrogen, sulfur and phosphorus, you probably alluded to that, is largely contained in organic matter. So cycling of those nutrients through organic matter is vital to plant productivity. So you have to have this active microbial life and the active carbon and nutrient cycle, as well as the backbone of carbon that supports that. Interestingly, char has been found to improve and increase microbial biomass consistently, whether it's in the Amazon or whether it's new char put in the soil, or whether it's the ancient char that is in Australian soils. In all cases, it has been found that there are more microorganisms and that the carbon cycles more efficiently through those microorganisms when they have this backbone of carbon char to hang on to. So it's not an either or, you need both. But you can capitalize on a more stable carbon that provides the habitat for the microorganisms while at the same time having more labile carbon to cycle through. Thank you.
And the question is, what are we going to do about population growth? And I'm going to throw to the head of the Farmers Federation, Andrew.
Well, if I can have a crack at it, I've been married 10 years and we're trying to have kids and we haven't been able to have any at this stage, so we're doing our bit. But look, I mean, if we're clear about this, the world's capacity to feed itself is there. I think it is there. And one of the things I've seen, I've been to the Ukraine and some of that country as the climate... Well, very good. Well, that's some very good soil, but it seems to be there is more opportunities there. But I think the challenge, though, you're talking about the population challenge. I mean, we still have an obligation, I think, to contribute as producers. We are a small population. We've got an obligation to contribute to feeding the world, and yeah, I don't know how you stop people from having children.
Fellow in the dark coat.
Anyone else want to try it?
Is this on?
Yeah.
So Michael Crawford, Department of Primary Industries here in Bendigo. Hearing about biochar and hearing about some of the experiences in Victoria and Australia, can you tell us a bit more about what's happening internationally in taking biochar from the applied research demonstration type activity into mainstream agriculture? Are there countries where biochar is now an everyday input in mainstream agriculture? And if so, how has it got to that stage?
No, thank you for the question. There's a nascent industry popping up in many countries, and interestingly, there are a great diversity of entry points that line up very much with what I talked about, the different value streams around biomass and biochar management. Interesting, in the US, for instance, there is a bill introduced and passed through Congress, that's the VHR bill, that promotes demonstration and research into biochar from a waste management angle, to look at invasive species management and looking at pyrolysis and biochar as a ways of controlling a waste problem. On the other hand, the politicians talk about it in Congress practically solely about biochar in the context of energy generation. The stakeholders, on the other hand, are neither interested in climate change nor in waste management, nor in energy generation. They are interested in having bigger turnips. And so if you go to a conference in, say, the northeast of the US, and you see farmers standing up and saying, this works for me, because I have tried many other things. Composts are too expensive for me. I have a lot of work in that. I tried biochar and it worked very well for my soils and for my crops. So you get, and then on the UN stage, we have a very great interest in the climate mitigation potential. So you get at least 4 different entry points for entering in the biochar discussion, and I think we will see that in the future to see which ones of those are really carrying the water. And I would think it's the farmers. At the end, we might find that the climate change will be a benefactor and maybe an important entry point, but I think it goes back to the farmers. The bottom line of greater soil fertility, of more sustainable cropping, will be the way that this will become a reality, and this must be done in a way that climate change mitigation is woven into this and might be a driver, but I think the bottom line will be the farmers and the soil fertility.
Thank you, Johannes. Stephen, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, there's already an industry in Japan, and we know that there are other smaller village-type activities throughout Asia. It's interesting, the Japanese used to have a very vibrant biochar industry, and it went down for a whole range of reasons. And now it's starting back again, and they use it for a whole range of different applications. So we had a conference in May in the Gold Coast, and we had a chicken farmer from Japan, talking about how he used biochar to improve his egg quality. So there is a lot more use of biochar in Asia than probably anywhere else in the world, I'd say, at the moment.
Thanks, Stephen. We've got a question from a councillor, but I can't read your name because Harold.
My name's Harold Flett. I'm from Donald. I'm a councillor of the Bull Oak Shire. I've been growing grain for nearly 50 years. My son went to school with Andrew's wife, so that's just something on the side. For the last 20 years, I've been stubble retention, not burning stubbles, getting them back into the soil, but understand now that the microbes in the soil release most of the carbon I'm trying to obtain through the natural process of the breakdown in the soil. Is biochar feasible and possible for broadacre grain growing, and how?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as with any soil management and crop management, there's no universal answer. There are only local solutions to local issues. While, for instance, certain biochar management in the Midwest and the US on good soils will never pay off, possibly in several situations, even biochar management for row crop agriculture in bad soils, and I'm afraid to say probably Australia is a good candidate for benefiting from such management, could actually work economically. I see great potential, especially in high-value crops anywhere in the world, but it really depends on the soil. And that's why we need to put the farmers into the driver's seat of research at this juncture of the development of innovative farm technology, because they need to decide whether it works for them. And as much as they need to decide where to put fertilizer and which crops grow best on which soils, they need to be able to decide and have the opportunity to decide and test this kind of technology on their soils. And then they will find out. I think this is the right moment to make that step. Thank you.
Stephen?
Yeah, we're actually been involved in doing broadacre trials in Western Australia with wheat, and the answers are not definitive, but it looks like it's going to fly. Basically, you need to get down to around about 100 kilos a hectare, and we're making formulations and that seem to do that. What I didn't mention in my presentation, we've done year one trials with HiFert in Victoria, and it was rather interesting. They used a diammonium phosphate at about 100 kilos a hectare. We put our biochar mineral complex on at 300 kilos a hectare, and we actually got double the yield to what they did, which at the price that we can produce it for makes it more economic than diammonium phosphate. There are some problems with the trials, and we're repeating those. But, you know, we're getting very close to actually, at the present price of DAPIT, I think it's about $800 a tonne or something. What's very interesting, and I didn't have time to talk about, of course, the price of chemical fertilisers is very much tied to oil prices. Oil prices are not going to go down for too much longer. So the economics of biochar is very closely tied with those prices. And if we ever started putting carbon taxes on those, then the economics are going to look very favourable. So within the Australian context, I think we actually have a real viable option in broadacre and in pasture.
Thank you, Stephen. We've got time for one more question, and it's the gentleman with the white hair, the white shirt and the blue top. And then after we answer this question, then I'm going to hand over to Tim.
The question is, how do we optimise carbon gain between that for plant productivity and that for soil accrual as organic matter?
Johannes.
I'm having these lame answers such as it all depends. But one story is, for instance, that there have been very good breeding done on improved soybeans and other beans for Africa that have improved the yields. But at the same time, they have bred them for greater yields, but lower carbon and nitrogen return to the soils. And what actually happened, and that corroborates what you're saying, that we actually mined the soils and decreased carbon contents rather than build soils for greater fertility for long-term improved crop yields. And so we can find ways of improving genetic material, crop, improved breeding to put carbon in soil as well as sustain yields. If I take the example of biochar, there are these type of technologies that attempt to do both, that attempt to build carbon, and you're absolutely right. The soil has a maximum capacity of building organic matter. Putting more on is a pretty good waste of good carbon that could be used in other areas to build organic matter or generate energy, fossil fuel offsets. In this particular case, I would say take the trash, as much trash off as you can without compromising soil cover and increasing erosion, and use that for energy gain, preferably pyrolysis, and return the char to soil rather than use the whole trash to unnecessarily cover the soil, which will not improve soil organic matter. Yeah.
I could just add a little bit to make it very, very relevant to everybody here in the room.
Just quickly, Alan, because we do need to wrap up.
Just quickly, what's happening is the carbon's going in and out, it's being consumed. So if you don't actually let plants grow after rainfall, they don't extend their roots out far enough into the soil, which means then that a lot of the moisture is left in the soil for the microbes to continue breaking down the organic matter and releasing it. So it's a bit Irish in some ways, but what you have to do, you've got to dry the soil out with plants. And if you dry the soil out with plants, it means that you're actually creating new carbon. And that's really what it's about. It's carbon at the margins. And I think that's where we're actually misunderstanding a lot of this debate.
Thank you, Alan. In 1898, Alfred Deakin made a speech in Bendigo, and I don't know whether it was in this hall, but it was a major speech making the case for federation. I know a few things about Alfred Deakin, and I don't think he was a bleeding heart lefty in any way. But in talking and reporting on the speech that he made, one of the commentators said that he spoke rapidly but clearly, with humour or a lofty eloquence as the occasion required. I've worked with Tim Flannery for a while. It's not a bad description for Tim. He's the curator of this series, and it should fall upon him to conclude today. And we really wouldn't be here if it were for Alfred Deakin, and we certainly wouldn't be talking about these issues if it weren't for Tim Flannery. And indeed, he is, I think, the person who, more than any other in Australia and possibly globally, has put these issues very squarely on the agenda of those who are concerned with the global climate problem. So, Tim, if you'd like to come up, if you could just say a few things.
Well, where to begin trying to summarise such a rich offering as we've had here today from our very, very fine panellists? I guess one thing I learnt from Steve and Joseph is that if you want to understand the fortunes of biochar, you may be well served by watching BP, fossil fuels, and the competitors being so closely linked. But I think that Alan Lauder said something that was very, very important, which is that a farm properly managed, which is capturing carbon and using it well, is also a highly profitable farm. So, and also a farming enterprise that's minimising methane production is a highly profitable farm, because the methane becomes animal protein if it doesn't escape from the animal. So we see there that in the agricultural sector, it's one of the few real winners where there really isn't a loss as we go to address climate change. It's not like the burning of fossil fuels where we've got to burn less in order to make progress. On the farm, doing the right thing by the climate problem is doing the right thing by your baseline profitability as well. The problem that we're facing, I guess, in the current world is that we live within an economic and social paradigm that drives us to deplete both our carbon reserves in our soil and our capital reserves in our bank account. And that's why so many farmers are going broke. I don't think, if I could respectfully disagree with Andrew Broad, I don't think it's all about tax. It's about creating the right economic environment to allow our farming enterprises in this country to be profitable and sustainable. And we have heard some fantastic ideas about how that may be achieved in future. It will mean changes in the taxation regime, for sure, in order to get it right. So differentially taxing high carbon versus low carbon products and so forth. But the opportunities there in the farm sector, in my view at least, are simply enormous, and it's worth having this debate, and we just have to get it absolutely right. Over the longer term, if we do that, we will end up creating a new relationship with our country, and one we can be proud in. I've been out to Michael and Therese Inwood's property at Bathurst, and when you look at the surrounding properties and the bared soil on some of them, the lack of biodiversity on them, and then you go into that property where there's zero kill being practiced, and you see the native animals, and you see the birds of prey, and all of the biodiversity enhancement you get along with a low carbon and profitable farm, you see that it's not just about money, it's about creating a new relationship with our country and creating a richer experience of what it means to be Australian. And that's why I'm so passionate about this stuff. It's not just about money, it's not just about this climate problem, it's actually about defining a new relationship between us and our country. It's going to take us a long time to get all of that right, but I think if we listen to people like our panellists that we've had today, we'll be taking the first steps on a long road. And could I just say before I finish, the one other area I wanted to just highlight was one that both Andrew Broad and Stephen Joseph touched on, the need for research and development in this area. We must make the effort in this country to investigate the sort of things that we've heard about here today, invest in our new industries, to get them beyond that little start-up stage, to get them through the valley of death that so many start-up enterprises fall into, so we've got a chance of applying them at the broad scale. Could I thank you all for being here today and say that along with the privilege of being here comes, I think, a bit of an obligation. You're the lucky 200, 250 people that got to hear these fantastic citizens that we've brought together today. And I would love to think that you might take what you've learnt today out into the community and discuss these ideas and be part of the change that we need to address. It's been fantastic being here with you, and thank you all for your participation.